EA's Star Wars Battlefront games are two extremely enjoyable catastrophes and/or disappointments that I am very familiar with. In this two-part series, I will analyze each of them for what I think they're worth and compare the two when the series is concluded. This video in particular will be both a critique and partially a defense of Battlefront 2015. I'll use the criticisms often levied at the game as a sort of rudimentary structure. We'll talk about game mechanics, map design, and vibes. Now, this YouTube thing is relatively new to me, not the writing part per se, but the video editing and voiceover. In addition to this, I'm not used to taking a critical look at multiplayer games, and thoughtful analysis of games like this isn't very common on YouTube, so I hope this is fulfilling to watch. Because this likely won't crack 100 views, I'd greatly appreciate the feedback of the few watching, and with that out of the way, let's begin. Star Wars Battlefront released in 2015 to widespread meh. The game was largely criticized for having overly linear maps in the large-scale game modes, lackluster single-player content, fewer maps than a game of this caliber should have, and shallow, repetitive gameplay. The overall theme was disappointment in the lack of content provided in the base game, something I completely understand. Had the game shipped with more maps and maybe faster progression, I think the critical reception would have been much warmer. There was also the controversy of the $50 season pass. The issue was that it was $50 extra for what was arguably an expansion that turned Battlefront into a finished game and not something that felt quickly manufactured to cash in on the sweet 2015 Star Wars hype. But after launch, after the dust had settled, there was still a large, weird community of half-sadistic fans like myself who were enjoying the game for what it was, and it only got better from there. Over the next few years, Battlefront was given 4 extensive updates providing new maps, weapons, star cards, and heroes. These updates included the Outer Rim update, the Bespin update, the Death Star update, and the Scarif update. All of these contributed new, exciting, and exotic locations, game modes, and game mechanics that transformed the face of multiplayer in both large and small-scale game modes. So, let's dive into this game, determine what made it special, and whether it was really as bad as they said. Right off the bat, let's take a quick step back into 2015 and examine the initial claims. Too few maps. Starting with the big modes, Walker Assault and Supremacy, by default you have 2 maps on Endor, Outpost Beta on Hoth, Graveyard of Giants on Jakku, the Sora Sub-Centraplex on Sullust, and the Junlun Wastes on Tatooine. That leaves us with 6. Not outstanding, but you end up with 2 more if you account for DLC. Continuing to list all the game modes and counting the maps before and after DLC would be tedious and a waste of your time, so here is the same information but condensed on screen. Looking at this may be confusing. It's hard to reconcile this image with the outrage that clung to this game for months post-launch. However, it is essential to remember that although each mode has decent variation as far as maps go, there is considerable overlap in which modes utilize which locations. So I took the liberty of making a Venn diagram showing the maps used between 3 smaller but popular game modes. I think you'd agree that what we have here is an uneven distribution of unique content. Bear in mind that this is 3 game modes out of a bit more than a dozen when you account for DLC. I don't even want to consider more than 3, but this is just an example, and even though this method of breaking down map usage is better than simply viewing numbers, it's important not to wholly rely on this either. Some maps utilize specific game modes better than others, and in the immortal words of Joseph Anderson, it's hard to wrap your head around, but not all good content is good when recycled, and not all bad content makes bad recycled content. Obviously this content isn't so much recycled, it's just being shared, but the principle is the same. These maps have their benefits for each game mode, but can sometimes feel like they were built with one in mind and then passed around to fill up space. This diagram isn't complete, by the way. They have way more locations in common, but I stopped where I stopped because it shows a clear picture of how content is distributed to each mode without too much clutter. In other words, the ratio would remain the same if I added each map to the diagram. So, the criticism of lackluster map selection does partially hold up, but not so much after updates. But it's worth considering how much those updates cost. The $50 season pass did increase in its value drastically considering how much content were added for its owners. Still, it shouldn't have been that expensive to begin with, considering the prevalence of microtransactions and lack of content in the base game. Moving back to these initial criticisms, we have lackluster single-player content. So I'm going to do a little rundown of single-player, but this won't include the skirmish modes because they exist to replicate multiplayer for people offline. So they weren't crafted for single-player exclusively. Starting off on a low note, missions are a joke, but at the same time, they're tutorials for the game's vehicles and heroes, so you can't expect them to be much more than that. Team battles are team battles, I guess, a chance for you and your friend, whether online or on the couch, to duke it out on any of the 4 available maps. You could play this mode solo, but you wouldn't want to. The AI is just completely brain dead, and they come in such small groups that there is absolutely no challenge to fighting them. Cranking up the difficulty only changes the damage they do to you. It's brain dead gaming, not fun in the least. Then you've got Survival, a mode where 15 waves of enemies assault your position. These waves get progressively more challenging through larger numbers and better equipment. Each of the 6 available maps has a safe place to camp if you want to play it safe, but every few rounds, drop pods are released that will give you these things. I believe the technical term is boosts. These pods incentivize enemy prioritization and intelligent play between rounds because you don't want to leave difficult enemies on the field when you claim a pod. Without this encouragement to leave your safe space, it would be a much worse mode. On more serious difficulties, the more formidable enemies spawn earlier and they do more damage. The Master difficulty is borderline impossible. Survival is the best part of single player to me. It's easily the mode with the most variation. So, once again, we have a criticism that is mostly true, but how much it resonates varies based on your subjective enjoyment of these modes. I don't think they're anything to write home about, but they're not horrifically bad either. So, we've addressed 2 somewhat hefty criticisms of Battlefront, but we have 2 left. Both of these will be addressed towards the end of the video because discussing them requires a dive into the meat of this game. So what is the actual game here? Well, it's a very gamey game. A gamey game that nails the aesthetics and sound of Star Wars, so let's start there. Battlefront is a game that looks great when in motion, particularly on the larger scale maps when there's more room for its chaos. When the lighting hits just right and the entire map stretches before you as you watch ships make strafing runs and 2 towering mechanoliths slowly walk forwards, it can look quite impressive. Of course, when you stop looking at the chaos and scrutinize the details, things do occasionally look a little fuzzy. Still, there are enough scenic vistas and small rooms packed with detail to prevent this from happening very often. Things look great from the ground. They also look good from above. As far as sound design goes, I think that sample speaks for itself, but I'll speak for it too just in case. The sound design is fucking incredible, and it plays a big part in creating this gamified but distinctly Star Wars atmosphere. The other essential part is the soundtrack. Gordy Hab's score was widely praised, but it'd be hard to fuck up the soundtrack when you have so much to draw from the original scores of the Star Wars films, and that's a lot of what you'll be hearing. Many themes from the movies are remixed or prolonged, and a few new compositions are implemented that take such clear inspiration from John Williams that they don't feel out of place. Unfortunately, you will often hear the same theme towards the end of most matches, but there's so much happening to distract the player that this never becomes an annoying quality. God, this tea is so fucking good. So, let's talk mechanics. Battlefront's multiplayer experience is held up by a complex web of options for weapons and star cards. Each of these has a benefit and drawback. Something like the pulse cannon allows you to kill enemies across the map, with the trade-off of being useless in a frantic close-quarters shootout. Something like the scattergun allows you to pierce through shields and insta-kill people in close quarters, with the trade-off of being useless beyond close range. The jump pack offers you a considerable advantage in mobility, with the trade-off of having 1 less slot for an offensive option. And of course, the jump pack is also essential for
fall, but she'll never lie down. It's not so bad. And I say, hey, 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 it's just an ordinary day, and it's on your state of mind. At the end of the day, you just got to say it's alright. It's alright, it's alright, it's alright.
There are a lot of choices here, which means a lot of opportunities to construct a unique loadout and playstyle. You could be that guy with the bowcaster, jump pack, and TL50 who constantly jets around trying to get mid-air kills and Kobe secondary explosive shots across the map. You could be that one dude with the DLT-19X explosive shot and sharpshooter trait that allows you to one-shot players from 100 meters away if you can account for the projectile speed and target movement, or you could be that objective player who carries the back-to-bomb to heal his teammates and a Dioxis grenade to keep enemies away from the objective. You get the picture. The way I see it, leaving the system of customization behind during the development of Battlefront 2 was a massive mistake, though I am getting ahead of myself. Back to the point, I was about to explain how incredible this system is for longevity. No configuration of star cards will make you completely invulnerable. There is always a counter to whatever equipment you're using, which means you're constantly at some level of risk. Of course, even with an array of abilities as diverse as this, there are a few standout choices. Because of this, you'll often find a lot of the same loadouts: jump pack, personal shield, and either the pulse cannon or scattergun. Those are extremely common choices. Some star cards are unfortunately too good not to use in some situations, but that doesn't mean the gameplay is without its tension. You can account for what other players are likely using and respond with shenanigans of your own to minimize the threat of, say, for example, a scatter shot from around the corner or one of those cunts using the bow rifle and shot grenade. This system is excellent for longevity because of the relatively high skill ceiling and the sheer number of options at your disposal. Once you get bored of whatever loadout you're running, you can switch to something new and weird for a while, or change to something new and also practical. Likewise, once you get close to the skill ceiling and combat starts to feel stale, you can intentionally make your playstyle a little more challenged to create some DIY variation. There are also these things that I called boosts earlier because I genuinely have no idea what the game calls them. They're spawned randomly around the map and give you a random piece of equipment, some of which are greatly useful and some of which are so profoundly useless you'll wish you'd never taken the time to pick them up. Nevertheless, these boosts add a nice spice to the average combat situation, and their implementation doesn't have any drawbacks. Well, I suppose it's arguable that these floating discs all over the map might detract from what is otherwise a visually consistent game. It certainly feels very arcade-like, but Battlefront is a very arcade-like, gamey game, so that may not be such a bad thing. However, I admit it doesn't feel very classy. So, those are the star card choices, but what about guns? There are roughly 20 choices, a bit over 20 actually, each with highly varied functions and quirks. Some exhibit the fundamental trade-offs that prompt the decisions you make in almost every game centered around shooting people. Do I want more range or faster cooldown? Do I want rapid fire or higher damage? Mexican or Mexicant, etc. There are a few choices that look like garbage and feel like garbage too, but over the years of playing this game, I found that it's less about stats and more about playstyle. For example, take the Briar pistol and the Shock Blaster. Up close, the Briar pistol does piss poor damage and the firing rate is awkward. Not exactly what a pistol should be, but when you pull L2, it charges a secondary fire, and if you've got good enough aim... Take the Shock Blaster. You get 3 shots before it overheats, and each of these can one-shot an enemy provided they aren't using the back-to-bomb, but the recoil is ludicrous and the range is dog shit. But if you use the Focus Fire Charge card, a card that concentrates blaster bullets in one direction, its range is boosted immensely. And if you're a cunt, you can also use the shot grenade and freeze people in place while you shoot them in the head. The guns also sound fantastic. There's only one repeated sound in the entire roster. It's a shame that the third-person point of view presents such a clear advantage in vision, because you can admire how intricate these models are in first person. It's also worth mentioning that all of these guns, except for ones that were added in DLC, have their root in the Star Wars films. With 2 exceptions, each gun has a use and is lethal in the right situation. It's not the most extensive selection, but it's one of the most varied I've encountered. The unfortunate thing about this whole system is the progression. It's remarkably sluggish, and it leaves you with few options initially. The XP to currency trade-off was insanely low until recently. As of now, the game has a permanent XP boost for everyone dedicated enough to be playing after all these years, so the ratio is much more forgivable. But what is there to spend currency on? Well, there's no shortage of cosmetics and plenty of funny emotes, and you'll also need credits to purchase more star cards and upgrades. There's also the rather strange feature of charge cards being in limited supply, so you'll have to buy more for 1,700 credits every few matches. I can only assume this is here to encourage thoughtful usage of your abilities, but it doesn't cost enough to matter after a certain point. Anywho, the cosmetics you can find at the shop are actually quite nice. You have loads of alien species to choose from on the Rebel side, in addition to X-Wing pilot gear, officer gear, and the like. On the Imperial side, you can only choose clothing and not your species because the Empire's Nazi! By the way, I'd like to let you know that audio bit of a guy saying Nazi is Mark Hamill. The point is, they all look pleasant. Also, this is just a neat little detail, but if you're wearing a default set of gear, it'll change on its own depending on the environment you're in. It also gets more and more battered the more you die. Cosmetics might seem useless, and I don't think they were intended You can also use certain sets to minimize your visibility to ships, as specific colors stick out like a sore thumb on certain maps. Speaking of maps, let's talk design, starting with Battlefront's flagship mode, Walker Assault. Walker Assault is broken into 3 phases corresponding to 3 sets of 2 uplinks. Because one side has the objective of keeping them activated and one has the goal of deactivating them, they are always a site of conflict. Frequently one will be indoors and one will be in the open, so they each contribute something varied to the gameplay of that phase. As the match progresses and the walkers move closer and closer to the transport, the scenery will often change significantly. I think this is exemplified best in Graveyard of Giants because, in terms of spectacle, this is where it reaches its peak. One phase takes place in primarily open terrain among scraps of war machines, and the second is defined by players fighting around a massive crashed cruiser. The third has both uplinks positioned around an enormous crater where you'll find the shell of a Star Destroyer's thruster. It's great. This mix-up is a consistent quality of Walker Assault maps. The phase changes change up the gameplay and the spectacle reliably and efficiently. Of course, this quality doesn't always transfer the same to the other large-scale modes, Supremacy and Turning Point, because the games aren't as linear. Moving to maps of smaller game modes, let's talk about Cargo. For those who are unaware, Cargo is basically Star Wars Capture the Flag. Each team starts with 5 cargo boxes, and the team that has the most cargo boxes by the end of 15 minutes wins. Securing all 10 wins the match instantly. This shit is so much fun. I don't know why every multiplayer game doesn't have Capture the Flag. Put that shit in Last of Us, Survivors, or Vigor, and I'd still play it. Put it in a World War I shooter, and I would still eat it up. Oh, I love Cargo so much. Anyways, I'm using Cargo to talk about smaller maps because I think the structure of the game mode makes the best use of the various pathways the player can take when transferring the cargo. When the goal is traversal from one end of the map to the other, the map structure matters far more, obviously. So, what do smaller maps look like? Most cargo maps have 2 polar ends and then 3 or 4 routes between them that occasionally overlap, but most of which cross through a reliably chaotic central area. Some maps include lots of long hallways and windows, which creates a setting ripe for tense shootouts and stealth kills. You'd be surprised how quickly Battlefront can turn into a horror game.
Attention, ils sont mieux armés que nous!
Some maps are architecturally cluttered, and some are sleek and minimalist. I just love playing Cargo so much though, I could play it on any map and I doubt it would be any less fun to me. Anywho, there are other small maps for Drop Zone and Blast, and as we've seen, some of these overlap with the Cargo maps, but generally these are far more spacious because the mode's focus is different. There's also this elegant touch the devs put in with the Skybox. In most outdoor maps, there's a fight between the Empire and the Rebellion happening in the sky. It's pretty nice to look at and easy to get distracted by. If you get lucky, the map you're on will have ships actually falling out of the sky, which sometimes land in a massive, very aesthetically and audibly pleasing crash. Before moving on, I'd like to touch on something. Visual fidelity. I don't need to say that this game looks good. The environments and models all look great for a 2015 game that only had 2 to 3 years in the oven. I'm aware that Battlefront 2 has it beat in nearly every metric except for arguably UI, but also, there's a certain charm to jank, isn't there? I think the less visually complex nature of games like this allows the art style to breathe, and when your art style is literally the aesthetic of Star Wars, that is more than ideal. More colors, more objects crammed into every square foot of terrain, more detail on every single object, more god rays. These things are more visually impressive, but they aren't always as pleasing to look at least to me. I feel I'm overcomplicating the issue, so I'll just end with this. More visual stimuli don't immediately create a better image, especially when it's an image that moves. Detail is good, and visual complexity can be good, but not if it ever has a negative effect on the art. Battlefront 2015 isn't quite as detailed as Battlefront 2017, but in a strange way it's more detail-oriented. It's about the little things, the way the environments move, the sound of the rain, seeing little animals jump across the terrain. When I recorded this, I didn't realize how fucking cheesy Dr. Sussy, Dr. Sussy. Fuck. Shit, I just said that. I didn't realize that rhymed. But I'm realizing it now while I'm cutting this together, and it's, man, what a fucking nightmare. These things feel special because there aren't very many on your screen at any given time. In Battlefront 2, these things are cranked up, but as I said, The game has its fair share of reused assets, but for the most part, these aren't very prominently featured, with a few exceptions. I find that these create a sense of visual cohesion not only on the planets that they are mostly found on, but also just because this is Star Wars. It makes sense that you'd find a few Star Wars-y items around the place. I mean, it's difficult to explain how well this game captures the aesthetic. There are so many little details in the movies that are just brought over and enhanced a little bit. You're not really going to recognize them until you play this game for a while and then watch the movies again, but they are seriously everywhere. It's incredible. I mean, the crates are just mind-blowing. There's so many good crates. Like, I was just watching the scene where Han is, like, packing up his shit and all his credits after saving Leia, and he's like, they nailed the crates that Han was carrying. It's just, there's a lot of fucking good crates in this game, man. Whew. So many good fucking crates. Anyways, enjoy this intermission.
Hello.
There are too many of them. What are we going to do?
You're now going to get macheted to death.
So, we've given a thorough rundown of most of what makes up the experience of Battlefront 2015, but I've saved the most significant blunder for post-intermission. Specifically, Lightsaber Heroes. There are only 2 Lightsaber Heroes in this game, and I can't fault them for that because this game is set in the OT era of Star Wars, otherwise known as the only good one. So, as far as the movies are concerned, we only have 2 characters that wield the lightsaber more than once available to us, Luke and Vader. Although this may seem disappointing, I am eternally fucking grateful that there are only 2 heroes afflicted with the sickness that is Lightsaber Combat. Lightsaber Combat is quite literally a game of who sees who first. The blocking is simply pathetic because there's no riposte mechanic, and the amount of time the block is available is set on a timer rather than being set on how many strikes or shots you're deflecting, which just doesn't make sense. There's also no dash move, so dodging is unavailable for slow-ass Darth Vader, and the other big misstep for Lightsaber Heroes is the lack of healing. Heroes have a significantly increased health bar compared to standard troops, but their health doesn't recharge. This may have been a misguided attempt to encourage players not to waste their time as a hero, to play carefully or whatever, but I would like to say, fuck that. Let me explain why this is bullshit. Some heroes are meant to be played defensively, and some are meant to be played offensively. Luke is primarily meant to play offensively, more so than any other hero. He's fast and he's got low health. Your best strategy is to get in and get out before you can take damage. But because there's no health regen, you're more likely to play defensively with a hero that begs to be constantly in and out of the action. The lack of healing is particularly harmful to Lightsaber Heroes, who are the most frequently played characters in the game, I might add, because you need to get within close range to fight. And traversal is just a nightmare because you're out in the open and you can barely move while you're blocking, and people just take the chance to ruin your day. Ugh. One of the worst things about this is that it sucks for new players who don't have the maps memorized to get used to. They don't know where to go, they don't know where to retreat, and... Ugh. Anyways, this turns your sessions as Luke or Vader into this weird game of staying out of sight in open territory and then carefully planning when to move into the next room, clear it out, and run away. This is less of a problem for Luke, slightly, because of his enhanced speed, and because one of his combat moves doubles as a speed boost both mid-air and on the ground. The block being on a timer exacerbates the issue of traversal, putting you in a vulnerable situation because you can't hold your guard for very long while walking in open spaces. Just... Okay, whatever, let's talk about the other heroes. Okay. Blaster heroes have it better with the whole healing thing. Oh shit! By the way, some heroes actually can heal. Leia and the Emperor can spawn health for themselves, whereas the others just have to search for the stuff during HVV and Hero Hunt. How the fuck is this better than just having a health? Blaster heroes have it better because health regen. Oh shit, I've just remembered. Bosk has health regen. It's why people pick him all the fucking time for their killmongering sprees during Walker Assault. They literally gave one character the ability to recharge health in large-scale game modes. Did they not understand the fucking ridiculous disparity? Health regeneration is less of an issue when you can be successful at long range, and blaster heroes who rely on close quarters combat are significantly tankier. The selection of heroes is actually quite good, I might add. Each one is a tangibly different experience from the others, and they're all overpowered in their own way. Combat between these characters... I just said combat. Combat between these two Fuck, it's not two, it's all of them. Combat between these characters can still sometimes be a matter of who sees who first, but your odds are better than in lightsaber combat. Also, I should mention that the attack animations don't flow together at all. You hit the button and just hope your enemy isn't hitting the button as fast as you. It's just so awful. Man, I should have another sip of tea. You know, I whinged about the whole health regen thing, but I think the way you get to play as heroes might be worse. You find a pickup. Yeah, just like those, like your boosts in your starships. You see an icon and you pray you get there before the others. And then you choose your hero, and these pickups spawn in the same places every time, so some players can memorize the locations and take them every game. Okay, I should settle down and talk about the positives now. Hero modes are pretty well done. The whole health regeneration thing is actually beneficial in Hero Hunt because heroes are forced to make intelligent plans regarding when they should go grab a health pickup. It also creates an incentive to guard the health pickups with your team, which makes cooperation easy, and making cooperation easy with randoms is a pretty cool thing. The goal of Hero Hunt is to do the most damage to the current hero before they die, and the highest ranked player gets to play as the hero next. I'm saying hero too much, it's really starting to grit on my ears now. HVV is an excellent game mode, superior to Battlefront 2's version in my opinion, because every round the heroes and support troops switch, and because different players regularly play different characters, there's a mix-up in each round. It's also worth mentioning the way rounds are broken up. In Battlefront 2, HVV is in a constant flow. Because of this, it is a game of momentum. In my experience, the team who gets the first 3 kills is likely to win the match. Because HVV is broken up into 5 rounds, your team has more opportunities to make a comeback. It's nice, but there isn't really anything else to say about this part of the game. So, let's return to those last criticisms. Shallow, repetitive gameplay. Let's start with shallow, which is of course the opposite of depth. The widely agreed upon definition of depth, or at least my favorite definition is, I don't know if it's widely agreed upon, anyways, it is the sum of your relevant balanced options. So, let's dissect small-scale encounters and large-scale objectives. Speaking of relevant balanced options, your choice of weaponry comes in the form of 20 different star cards and 9 charge cards, of which you could create endless possible configurations, not all of which would be useful. Oh, and also traits. Pause if you want an overview of what traits are, they're not very interesting. Find your loadout and let's see what combat looks like under the microscope. I'm going to assume for the purpose of this that you're running a rather generic loadout. So, what are your options in the average encounter? What are your relevant options? Retaliate, evade, or delay. These options can take many different forms, but they are consistently present, and each is a test of twitch reflex. Delay may take the form of a dodge roll or a personal shield, evade could be a jump pack or roll or sprinting away from the threat, retaliate could be a scattergun to the face or a desperate volley of blaster bolts amidst frantic jumping, or a war flashback followed by a kamikaze impact grenade. You get the picture. Battlefront is not unique for providing these options. They are present in most multiplayer. Actually, they're present in most games. What elevates this trifecta of choices in Battlefront is the variation with which you can do each. It's not exceptionally deep, at least not on its own. The number of options at your fingertips and their balance depends on how you play and how you've customized yourself, and that's not the only part of the depth left entirely to you. And now we come to the second kind of depth, the depth of looking cool, and the depth of styling on rebel scum and dancing on their heads. Intrinsic motivation. If your ambition ends with killing enemies with the maximum efficiency, Battlefront's gameplay systems will take you far, but never as far as they could if you were just a bit less mature. If you want to kill people and look badass, there's far more in store. In this area of gameplay, the jump pack does most of the heavy lifting. The ability to fly, limited as the flight itself may be, will always create intrinsic depth. Aiming whilst airborne is a skill that requires hours to master on its own, and it only emerges as a viable option for those who want to look stylish. It's the same with shooting people out of the air and shooting people out of the air while in the air. There is no point to this. The dodge roll also has its uses for adding some intrinsic spice. The roll is practically a dash if you angle it correctly. It both serves as a utility in that it makes you harder to hit, but because you can fire while you roll, it can also serve as a way of saying, just for funsies, I killed you while making it harder on myself to do so. And if that isn't the Imperial dream, I don't know what is. I could go on, but I won't. But I could. With that, let's return to the questions which sparked that little exploration. Is the combat shallow? Well, its balance and thus its depth inevitably varies based on the nuances of your particular situation and your particular loadout, but it's not unbalanced. There's no get out of danger free card for every situation, only mitigate danger for free cards in specific environments. The intrinsic depth certainly isn't shallow, but that isn't a factor for every player. So is the combat repetitive? Only if you make it repetitive, which is likely to happen at lower levels due to the sluggish progression and a lack of confidence. Otherwise, the combat isn't repetitive unless you play in a repetitive way. We've seen that the depth within combat isn't half bad, so let's talk about the depth of your options in terms of team play and objectives, starting with what is arguably the most complex mode, Walker Assault. You've got 2 uplinks, and the rebels want them activated because one more Y-Wing bomber is called in every minute or so that the uplink remains activated. More Y-Wings mean more time when the AT-AT walkers have their shields down during the phase transitions, which is the only time the rebels can deal damage. If one of the 2 walkers is still standing by the end of the match, it blows up the rebel transport ship and the rebels lose. So you've spawned into a Walker Assault match. What can you do? You can activate or deactivate an uplink, or you could take to the sky and strafe the enemies at one uplink station, or you could defend an uplink that your team has already captured. If you're a rebel, you can use the snow speeder to trip the walkers at the end of the match, or just go on a killmongering spree and not worry about the objectives. So, not a whole lot, but not a pitiable number of options either. The best thing about this system is the tangibility of your actions. Taking an uplink station on your own is entirely doable, in most cases, and it has a positive effect on your team. In a game like Battlefield 1 or even Battlefront 2, I found that it takes a large portion of your team to make a difference in the match, and as we know, cooperation with randos is a matter of luck. And that's the height of game mode complexity as it relates to objectives, and it was 1 paragraph. It's worth mentioning that game modes with more complex objectives were added in the DLCs, particularly in the Bespin and Scarif updates, but they're only complicated in that their phases are different. The act of pursuing the objective early doesn't pay off later the way it does in Walker Assault. Instead, you have a chore to do, and failing will cause you to be assigned another chore until the game ends. So, are the objectives and modes shallow? I think it's pretty 50-50, but 50% is a failing grade. Are they repetitive? Unfortunately, yes. If you compare this game to the other juggernauts in the world of shooters, doesn't really matter which one you pick, Battlefront probably has more to offer, mainly because the second-to-second gameplay is elevated by its setting. Star Wars. Running around these iconic locations, shooting these funky-sounding guns, and murdering pop culture icons is far, far more memorable than boring one-note slogs through nameless places with flat color grading in an attempt to kill evil Arab faction number 6 or genocidal Russian army number 9. It's not often discussed. I should have a fucking sip of liqueur. That sounds so fucking good right now. Hell yeah. Oh, that tickled. Anyways, it's not often discussed because it's hard to articulate, and it doesn't have the same effect on everyone, but the presentation of any game can significantly enhance gameplay. For Battlefront, the experience would be improved for Star Wars fans, obviously, so someone in the target demographic for Star Wars would likely play this game long past its expiration date. If you haven't noticed, I'm talking about myself. I'm not exactly in the target demographic for Star Wars anymore, but the nostalgia for when I was continues to fill up the space where once my love for this franchise boiled and made even the dullest of Battlefront's gameplay engaging and rewarding. I wanted to spend time in the Star Wars universe, fucking people up and playing Capture the Flag. I still do today, even though the music and art don't give me the same feelings of whimsicality and immersion that they used to. I'm aware of how tangential that probably felt relative to the somewhat cut and dry feeling of the rest of this video, but it'd be pretty weird if I weren't nostalgic for Star Wars Battlefront. I'm pretty sure my parents signed their divorce papers while I was mowing people down in an AT-ST on Endor. And of course, Battlefront is far, far, far from a perfect game, but underneath all the soot and old controversy, there is still a lot to be enjoyed here, especially for Star Wars fans. So, now that we're all out of words to dump onto a page, let's pick them back up and rearrange them into some semblance of a conclusion. What does all this leave us with? Well, something fun, something strange, and a little bit shit that can be a wonderful experience for those it was crafted for. That's Star Wars fans if you're a bit slow. We are left with a phenomenal system of customization that is somewhat crippled by overly expensive upgrades, pointlessly slow progression, and about 3 star cards that are too good to be avoided. We are left with a game with more iconic characters than most studios could dream of having access to, and a gross mishandling of how combat should operate with these characters. We have a game filled with mostly shallow game modes with gratifying gameplay carrying the dead weight of its mostly uninteresting objectives. On the other hand, we have a visually beautiful game that boasts some of the best sound design the medium of games has to offer, and we are left with a game that nailed its most crucial task, being a fun game set in the Star Wars universe. The gamified Star Wars atmosphere is so thick you have to cut through it with a cortosis machete, and it is an addicting feeling for those who love or used to love this franchise. Star Wars Battlefront is a disaster and a diamond. Its failure of a launch taught EA a lesson, and during its redemption arc, it sold 12 million copies. Thankfully, EA would never make the mistake of providing a dismal amount of content at launch and would never create a microtransaction-based economy again. Right?
Yeah, I'm feeling good tonight. Finally feeling free and it feels so right. Oh, time to do the things I like. Gonna see a princess, everything's alright. Oh, no job but an answer to. Ain't a fixture in the palace zoo. No, and since the carbonite's off me, I'm living life now that I'm free. Yeah, told me get myself together. Now I got myself together. Now I made it through the weather. Better days are gonna get better. I'm so happy the carbonite is gone. I'm moving on. I'm so happy that it's over now. The pain is gone. I'm putting on my shades to cover up my eyes. I'm jumping in my ride. I'm heading out tonight. I'm solo. I'm hunting solo. I'm hunting solo. I'm hunting solo. Solo. I'm picking up my plaster, putting it on my side. I'm jumping in my falcon, whooping at my side. I'm solo. I'm hunting solo. I'm hunting solo. I'm hunting solo. Solo. I'm hunting solo.
So far, so good. And how far can you go?
Stay tuned for part 2.